Okay, so we've got a lot to cover today, and I'm really glad to have you here to help us sort through this significant change in U.S. immigration policy.
Yeah, it really is a pretty big deal, and there's so many different angles to consider.
For sure. And as of March 24th, 2025, just coming up really soon, the Trump administration is taking steps to revoke the temporary legal status of a really large number of immigrants.
Yeah,
We're talking about around 530,000 people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela.
right. It's a really rapid shift, and it's impacting a lot of people. Just a few days ago, on March 21st, the Department of Homeland Security announced they're ending the CHNV parole program. This was something that was put in place during the Biden administration.
Right, the CHNV program.
Mm.
That stands for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and it's been allowing folks from those countries to enter the U.S. and live here legally for up to 2 years.
Yeah, and it's not just about being present in the U.S. It gave them temporary permission to be here, but also work permits and protection from deportation.
Mm.
So for those 2 years, they were allowed to work, and they didn't have to worry about being immediately sent back to their home countries.
And I think that's a really important point to highlight, right? Like, this wasn't a path to permanent residency or citizenship, but it did provide a measure of stability and allowed people to rebuild their lives, at least for a while.
Absolutely. It was a temporary authorization that was intended to address a specific set of circumstances. But that avenue is going to be closed off as of April 24th, 2025. So these individuals, unless they can find some other legal basis to stay in the U.S., they're going to lose their work permits and that protection from deportation they had.
Okay, so we're talking about over 500,000 people facing a really uncertain future.
Right. And it all stems from this decision to terminate the CHNV program.
So maybe let's take a step back and remind ourselves how this program came to be in the first place.
Sure. So the CHNV program was a Biden administration initiative. It started back in October 2022, and it was initially just for Venezuelans. Then in January of 2023, it was expanded to include Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua.
And I remember at the time there were a lot of discussions about the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border and how the Biden administration was trying to manage what some people were calling a crisis at the border.
Right. And the CHNV program was seen as a way to address that by offering a legal pathway for people to come to the U.S. The idea was to create an alternative to irregular migration by allowing up to 30,000 eligible individuals per month from those four countries to come in legally.
So instead of people risking dangerous journeys and crossing the border without authorization, they could apply for this program, and if they met the requirements, they could come to the U.S. in a safe and orderly manner.
Exactly. And those requirements were pretty specific. To be eligible, you need to have a financial sponsor here in the U.S., someone who could vouch for you and provide financial support. You also had to pass security vetting, and obviously if you had a criminal history or were considered a security risk, you wouldn't be approved.
It sounds like a pretty rigorous process, and if you got through all of that, then you'd receive this temporary parole status, which, as we've talked about, allowed you to work legally in the U.S. for 2 years.
Right, so it wasn't a permanent solution, but it did provide a window of opportunity for people to come to the U.S. and get back on their feet.
And it seems like a lot of people took advantage of this program. Our sources indicate that by the end of 2024, over 532,000 migrants had entered the U.S. through the CHNV program.
Yeah, those are pretty big numbers. And it's interesting to see how it breaks down by nationality.
Yeah.
Roughly 213,000 of those were Haitians, 120,700 were Venezuelans, 110,900 were Cubans, and 93,000 were Nicaraguans.
So we're not just talking about a small group of people here. These are sizable communities that have been building roots in the U.S. over the past couple of years.
Absolutely. And that's why this decision to end the program has generated so much controversy and concern.
So if we look back at the Biden administration's rationale for creating this program, it seems like there were two main reasons.
Yeah. One was a belief that it was helping to reduce irregular migration, or at least manage it more effectively. And the other was a humanitarian response to the difficult situations people were facing in their home countries.
Right. I mean, you mentioned Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti. Those are countries grappling with political instability, economic hardship, and in some cases, widespread violence. So the Biden administration argued that this program was a way to offer safe haven to people who were fleeing those conditions.
Exactly. But as we know, the political landscape changed with the 2024 election, and the new Trump administration has a very different perspective on immigration.
Yeah. And that shift is really evident in this decision to terminate the CHNV program. When President Trump came into office in January 2025, he issued a directive aimed at dismantling what he called categorical parole programs that he saw as going against U.S. policy.
And the CHNV program was clearly one of the programs he had in his sights. The Department of Homeland Security, under Secretary Kristi Noem, has laid out several reasons for ending the program.
So let's dive into those reasons. One of the key arguments we've seen is that the program didn't serve a significant public benefit.
Right, and that's a phrase that gets tossed around a lot in these debates about immigration. What exactly constitutes a significant public benefit is open to interpretation. Some people might argue that allowing these individuals to work and contribute to the U.S. economy is a public benefit. Others might say it's about offering refuge to people fleeing persecution.
But the Trump administration's view seems to be that the CHNV program didn't meet that threshold. They also claim that it wasn't effective in reducing irregular migration or addressing the domestic impact of that migration.
Yeah, and they've been critical of the whole idea of using parole in this way. They say it's not how parole was originally intended to be used.
Right. The administration is pushing for a return to a case-by-case parole system where individuals have to apply based on very specific circumstances and demonstrate a compelling reason for why they should be granted parole.
And that's a much higher bar to clear than the requirements for the CHNV program. Under a case-by-case system, it's a lot harder to predict who will be approved and who won't.
And crucially, the Trump administration is really emphasizing the temporary nature of parole. They're making it very clear that parole was never meant to be a backdoor to permanent residency.
Right, and they're urging those who are admitted under the CHNV program to leave the U.S. by April 24th or face the possibility of deportation if they don't have some other legal basis to stay.
So let's talk about the potential consequences here. If the program ends and deportations begin, we're talking about a potentially huge logistical undertaking. I mean, how do you even go about deporting over 500,000 people?
It's a massive challenge, and it raises all sorts of logistical and diplomatic hurdles. Let's start with Cuba. Historically, they've only accepted a very limited number of deportation flights from the U.S., sometimes just one flight per month. So trying to send tens of thousands of Cubans back under those conditions would be incredibly difficult.
And then there's Venezuela and Nicaragua. Both countries have had strained relations with the U.S., and in the past, they've outright refused to accept deportees.
Right. So even if the U.S. wanted to deport people to those countries, it's not clear they would be able to. Though there has been a recent development with Venezuela agreeing to resume repatriation flights, which could potentially ease that particular logjam.
But even with that agreement, the overall situation remains incredibly complex. And then there's Haiti. While they might be more willing to accept deportees, the ongoing instability and violence in the country make large-scale repatriation a real humanitarian concern.
Imagine you're one of these individuals who fled your home country, came to the U.S. under this program, built a life here, and now you're suddenly facing the prospect of being sent back to a place that might be incredibly dangerous. It's a deeply unsettling situation.
Absolutely. And beyond the logistics of deportation, we also have to think about the impact this could have on U.S. communities and the economy. Many of these individuals have been working here paying taxes, contributing to their local economies.
Right. Their kids are in schools. They're part of communities. They've been building lives here. And suddenly uprooting them could have ripple effects throughout society. Businesses could lose employees, families could be separated, and local economies, especially in places with large populations from these countries, could take a hit.
So it's not just about the individuals being deported, it's about the broader impact on the places where they've settled. And as you might expect, this decision has already sparked legal challenges. Advocacy groups and some of the affected immigrants themselves are filing lawsuits trying to block the termination of the program.
Yeah, those legal challenges are already underway, and they raise some important questions about the legality of the administration's actions and whether they've followed the proper procedures for ending the program. These court battles could drag on for a while, which adds another layer of uncertainty to the whole situation.
And alongside the legal challenges, we're also seeing strong reactions from elected officials. There was a pretty powerful statement from Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a Democrat from Florida. She called this a heartless act and said it would rip families apart and create chaos for people who had been legally admitted to the U.S.
Her district in Florida has a large immigrant population, so she's seeing the potential impact of this decision firsthand. And her statement really underscores the human cost of this policy change. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are real people with families and lives and dreams.
And it's worth noting that this decision to end the CHNV program isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a larger pattern we've seen from the Trump administration when it comes to immigration.
Absolutely. Earlier this year, they announced the termination of temporary protected status, or TPS, for Haitians and Venezuelans. And there's even been talk of potentially revoking parole for some of the Ukrainians who came to the U.S. fleeing the war with Russia. So there's a definite trend here, a move to scale back or eliminate many of the humanitarian-based immigration programs that were in place under the previous administration.
And it's interesting that this particular action is targeting people who came to the U.S. through legal channels. They didn't cross the border illegally. They applied for this program. They met the requirements and they were allowed in.
Right, and that's what makes this so different from some of the other immigration debates we've seen. This isn't about border security or cracking down on undocumented immigrants. It's about revoking a legal pathway that was already in place.
So as we think about the potential ramifications of this policy change, it's important to keep that context in mind. And as you might expect, public opinion on this is divided. There are those who support the Trump administration's decision. They argue that the Biden administration overstepped its authority by creating the CHNV program in the first place.
And they say that ending the program is about restoring order to the immigration system and putting American interests first. And if you look at some of the online chatter, especially on platforms like X, there's definitely a segment of the population that sees this as a positive step, a move towards stricter immigration control.
But on the other side, you have those who are deeply critical of this decision. They see it as a cruel and short-sighted policy that will cause unnecessary hardship and suffering.
They point to the humanitarian crises that are driving people to flee their home countries, and they argue that the U.S. has a moral obligation to offer refuge to those in need. And they emphasize the contributions that these immigrants have already made to the U.S. and their potential to contribute even more if they're allowed to stay.
So you have these two very different perspectives clashing, and it's playing out against the backdrop of this looming April 24th deadline. So with that deadline fast approaching, what should we be looking out for in the coming weeks and months? What are some of the key things to watch?
Well, for the individuals who are admitted under the CHNV program, the most pressing issue is finding a way to stay in the U.S. legally. The window to apply for other forms of relief, like asylum or green cards, is closing rapidly.
And those processes are notoriously complex and time-consuming. There's no guarantee of success, and even if someone does apply, it could take months or even years for their case to be decided.
And the Department of Homeland Security has made it clear that they intend to prioritize the arrest and deportation of anyone who doesn't have a pending application or some other legal basis to stay in the U.S. after the deadline. So we could see a real uptick in enforcement actions in the near future.
And of course, we'll be watching closely to see how the legal challenges to the program's termination play out. If a court were to rule against the administration, it could potentially throw the whole situation into disarray.
And then there's the issue of deportation. Even if the administration is able to overcome the legal and logistical hurdles we've discussed, actually carrying out mass deportations on this scale would be a monumental task. It would strain resources, it would test diplomatic relationships, and it would raise all sorts of ethical and humanitarian concerns.
So there are a lot of moving pieces here, and the situation is incredibly fluid. But to sum up what we've talked about today, we're looking at a significant policy shift with the termination of the CHNV program. This decision has the potential to impact hundreds of thousands of people who've been living and working in the U.S. legally, and it raises a host of complex questions about the use of parole in the immigration system, the role of humanitarian considerations in immigration policy, and the broader direction of U.S. immigration policy under the Trump administration.
And it's a decision with far-reaching consequences. It will impact individuals and families, it will impact communities and businesses, and it will have ripple effects throughout U.S. society. And as we move closer to that April 24th deadline, the stakes will only get higher.
So thinking about everything we've discussed and the limited time frame these individuals have left to figure out their next steps, what do you see as the most significant challenge or potential outcome of this policy change in the coming months?
You know, it's hard to say for sure, but I think one of the biggest challenges will be finding a way to balance the administration's desire for stricter immigration control with the humanitarian needs of the individuals who are caught in the middle of this policy shift. And I think the outcome that everyone is hoping to avoid is a mass deportation scenario that would be chaotic, traumatic, and ultimately harmful to everyone involved.
Well said. And that's a sobering thought to leave us with.
Yeah.
But it's an important reminder of what's at stake here. And I want to thank you for taking the time to break all of this down for us. It's been a really informative conversation.
My pleasure. It's a complex issue, and it's one that deserves careful consideration and thoughtful discussion.
Absolutely. And we'll continue to follow this story closely and keep our listeners updated on any new developments.
Sounds good.
Until next time, thanks for joining us for the deep dive.
Take care.